Good evening, everyone. I'm David Epstein from the Chifley Research Centre, coming to you tonight from a very dodgy NBN satellite connection, where unfortunately I can see and hear everyone, but I'm experiencing a major upload lag. So we do apologise for that at the start of tonight's presentation. I'm coming to you from the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation in Victoria, and the Chifley Research Centre is located on Ngunnawal land. On behalf of the centre and of everyone here, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on where we're all meeting and speaking from tonight, and to pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Thank you for joining us in the second of the Chifley Conversations. We're going to follow the same format that we started with last week, which is approximately 45 to 50 minutes of conversation with our guests, of which the last 10 or 15 minutes will be questions, if I can manage to facilitate them coherently via this satellite link. I'd like to welcome both John and George to our conversation tonight. For those who don't know either of our guests, John has variously been a journalist, an academic, an advisor and biographer to Prime Minister Keating, and he's also a former member of the Reserve Bank Board of Australia. Last April, he wrote a very prescient Lowy Institute paper on Australia and the pandemic and emerging from the pandemic. George is a distinguished journalist also, and public intellectual and essayist. Like John, he's had some things to say about how we've handled the pandemic in Australia and what we should be looking to as we emerge from the pandemic. Most recently, in his recent quarterly essay, which was published at the start of July. So we've had a little bit of time for things to move on since both of these publications. Initially, for the first 10 minutes or so, I'd like to invite John and George separately, beginning with John, just to give us a bit of an overview of what you're currently feeling about the impact of the pandemic on Australia and the Australian economy. Recap what you had to say in your individual essays, and perhaps tell us whether you think anything has changed since you've published those essays. So John, over to you.
Thanks, David. Well, we've been ravaged by COVID. It's certainly the worst public health experience in my lifetime, and it's cost us a lot in physical health, mental health, in mortalities, in public concern, and there have been very considerable economic costs. There's lost GDP, which we'll never recover. Commonwealth debt has doubled, it'll be, have trebled compared to pre-pandemic levels by 2025. Our work, our lives, our education have all been disrupted. But having said all that, the economic effects have proved very transitory. We bounced out of the last phase of COVID last year, and we'll bounce out of this one. We'll certainly see a fall in output for this current quarter. It's possible, but unlikely, that we'll see a fall in output for the December quarter, the last quarter of the year. But by the time we know about it, we'll be well out of it. We won't know about what's happening to that quarter until the beginning of March next year. And by then, I expect we'll be travelling a long way away. It's interesting today when we saw the June quarter GDP numbers that to the end of June The Australian economy had, compared to the previous June, it expanded 9.6%, you know, a really big bounce. Well, why is this so? As I pointed out in the book, we call it a lockdown, but in fact, most employees are still working. Most production still occurs. Office workers working from home, public services still working, teachers, healthcare, farming, mining, much of construction, much of manufacturing, utilities, public transport, commercial transport, all still engaged and still engaged today. So that's one reason. And of course, we had huge fiscal support, very well targeted and very, very substantial Commonwealth government response, very early and very big. But not only that, we've had a very strong response from the Reserve Bank, very strong monetary policy response. I think it's probably not widely appreciated that the response of the Reserve Bank of Australia has been stronger than the US Federal Reserve. That is, our rates are lower than in the US. The RBA, the Reserve Bank of Australia, has bought more of the stock of government bonds in Australia proportionally than the Fed has in the US, and it's done so very quickly. And that's why we've got currency today, 72 cents, very cheap compared to where it's been, 79 cents, for example, at the beginning of this year. So the Reserve Bank's been good, and it's assured us that basically rates are not going to go up till 2024. Well, where will we be in the first quarter of next year? I think we'll be doing well. We'll essentially be back in many respects in the economy left behind in 2019 with the same kind of strengths, same kind of weaknesses. That is, we were completing then, just about to complete the 30th year of economic upswing. We had seen over that period a doubling of output, huge growth in population, big increases in employment and participation in the workforce, big increase in income per head. And compared to the US, very much more equally distributed than elsewhere. So we'll be back there, but we'll also be back with the problem we had before, the major problem, I think, which is, to my mind, the big issue we face going forward, is very low rate of growth of productivity, of output per hour worked. It seems to be attributable to the way in which we use capital and labour is not as clever as it could be. That, I think, is where the focus of policy has to be coming out of this. That and the difficulty of our relationship with China, about which we'll no doubt say more. I'll leave it there, David.
Thanks for that, John. George, over to you. Do you differ in that perspective?
I might differ at the margin. I think I might start by giving you a window into the turnaround for a quarterly essay. So the essay was conceived last year when we were still coming out of the recession. So the framing was recession. Once I'd finished the research and started typing early in the year, we were, as John points out, roaring back from that first national lockdown, which was essentially March, April to May, when we lost close to 1 million actual jobs, and there was a reduction to 0 hours for another 1 million people. The recovery from that recessionary episode, that lockdown episode, that stay-at-home episode, has no precedent. The lockdown itself had no precedent, but the recovery had no precedent. We pretty much restored all the jobs in a nominal sense that we'd lost in the first lockdown within 12 to 13 months. So by, say, April and May of 2021, John, correct me if I'm wrong, we were back to where we were in February of 2020. The women in the labour force recovered their jobs about a month earlier than the men. Queensland went first, then WA, then SA, then Tassie. I think New South Wales is the last in the queue of the states, but we don't have a precedent to match it. The counterfactual is the early 1990s recession. In a GDP sense, it's just 4 quarters and fits neatly into the financial year 1991. We lost a lot of work. We lost a lot of jobs in that financial year, but then we lost more jobs, and some of them never came back because they were structural, through 91 into 92. And the unemployment rate, as we remember, peaks at about 11% in 1993. And it takes a good 10 years before we're back to where unemployment was in 1989. So that's your counterfactual. The recession that was forced on us by government policy as a health order, we're out of it in 12 months. The previous recession, the recession we supposedly had to have, took us, the scarring of that was many years. In fact, it ran through the 90s in one manner, shape or form. Now, the essay switched from sweating the recession to explaining how it is that all the arms of policy were sort of brought to bear to protect us on the way down and to allow the economy, once the tightest of the restrictions were eased, to basically return to where it had been. And one of my little arguments in the essay, one of the things I sort of raise is not just the experience of the early 1990s informed the fiscal response, also the experience of the 1990s and the lessons of 2008-9, which is the global financial crisis, which is a pretty good story for Australia. We're the only G20 nation that our economy didn't contract over the 12 months of the GFC, 2008-9. South Korea only had 1 quarter of negative growth. We had 1 quarter of negative growth as well, but South Korea's quarter was a big one. And over the course of that financial year, they went backwards. We're the only G20 country that didn't go backwards. I can find only one other country in the OECD that didn't go backwards over that period, and that's Poland. So we had a pretty good story to tell then and there as well. I did want to sweat that particular detail because we had a Labor government that was prepared in 2008-9 to learn the lessons of the early 1990s recession. And you had a Treasury that was prepared to advise a Labor government to go early, go hard, go household. We have a coalition government in charge, a coalition government that was surprised to be there. I think they're surprised to be re-elected in 2019. They'd certainly sacked themselves twice because they got rid of both Abbott and Turnbull before the 2019 election. So they're a government not in the same position that Rudd Labor was going into the 2008-9 episode. They're a tired government for all intents and purposes, even by their own admission. Now, the advice that came to them from Treasury dealing with that super shock of lockdown, and knowing that close to 1 million people are going to lose their jobs, they're going to be stood down during that lockdown, that advice was calibrated very carefully by Stephen Kennedy, especially as Treasury Secretary, who was in the room during the GFC. Now, he didn't want to say to them, and you can't blame the guy, he didn't want to say to them, look, Ken Henry and Martin Parkinson came up with the world's best practice in 2008-9. All you need to do is go back to the right playbook and we'll do it again this time around. He didn't do that, and nor should he have done, obviously dealing with a coalition government. But it was interesting the way he tailored his advice to them. He said, you don't want to repeat the mistakes that were made in 2008-9. And the mistakes that he kept reminding them in all their discussions in early March and April of 2020 were not to invent new programs, not to take the opportunity of this crisis to do new things like the home insulation program. And there was a penny drop for the coalition. The advice framed that way convinced them not to spend $2 or $3 billion on a home insulation program, but released them to spend up to $130 billion on JobKeeper. Now, he's one of my heroes in the essay. Unsung, I don't want him to sort of join the Treasurer or necessarily the Prime Minister at the podium as the way some other figures have been trotted out during the pandemic. But it was a relief to me when I went through and I spoke to a number of people on the government within the bureaucracy and outside who had good vision back into what was going on. And I was pleasantly surprised by the Treasury's adaptability and the coalition's willingness to listen. I know in the early phase of lockdown, they weren't that keen on a wage subsidy, but they quickly came to the party. Yeah, all this as it evolves, as the essay's been prepared, you're telling a pretty good story about Australian resilience and almost a repetition of history with 2008-9. But I was always mindful as I was preparing the essay that we had missed that golden window of opportunity to open up, and the rest of the world was preparing to open up, because we didn't get to first base on the vaccination program. Now, the vaccination program, for want of a better metaphor, reminded me of what happened next after the GFC. It's same but different, but still very interesting to observe these patterns repeating. Rudd's obviously a first-term Prime Minister, a hero after the GFC. All these fellow leaders in the G20 are asking him, how did you do it? Scott Morrison's in an equivalent position now. All the leaders of the G20 are asking him, how did you keep the death rate so low? You've heard the numbers the Prime Minister trots out. If we'd had the OECD average death rate, we'd have lost 30 to 40,000 lives by now in the pandemic. If we had the UK, by the way, if we had the UK or the US death rates in this pandemic, we'd have lost 50,000 people by now. So he's getting his backslaps the same way Kevin Rudd was getting his backslaps. But the very next thing they were going to do, when they were going to spend all this capital that they'd accrued during the crisis, for Kevin Rudd it was climate change. For Scott Morrison, it was the vaccination program. We know what happened, obviously, in 2009. Bipartisanship was sort of looming, but didn't happen. Coalition changed leaders, and before you know it, a lot of other things happened, which probably for this audience I don't want to remind you of. But with Morrison, you almost had a parallel journey to that letdown after the perfectly handled crisis, which is the crisis the first few months last year. Couldn't get the thing that involved the Commonwealth pulling a lever, not an emergency lever to support an economy in a downturn, but a lever that would create something in recovery. And we know where we are today because of slow rollout of vaccine. But, and this is the question for me, the question I've sort of left open, yes, and I left it open deliberately. Having repeated this history of not being able to make something of the crisis, are we now about to repeat the mistake of 2008-9 when we sort of snatched mediocrity from the jaws of a world-class achievement? That's where the essay finishes off. The essay also looks at the role of government, which we might discuss. I don't want to lead any of your questions, David, but we might think about the role of government and what we've learned through this pandemic in the discussion. The essay, we hit print on June 7. I remember this date specifically. It's a Monday at the beginning of the month. The first at the end of the first week of June, the 7th. And it goes to print on the 28th, and we've extracted in the Fairfax papers on the 26th. Now, what do you think happened between June 7 and June 28? We know on the 16th, because that's when it was announced, a limousine driver from Bondi has picked up flight crew from the FedEx, courier jet, international arrivals. He's not wearing a mask. He's not vaccinated. The Berejiklian government, urged on by the Morrison government, obviously in Canberra, decides to leave the economy open. A couple of weeks later, bang, Sydney's in lockdown, and it's still in lockdown today. Now, I had anticipated in the essay, because you do leave this, you have to leave this open for yourself as a writer when you're writing in real time. I anticipated the possibility of a third extended lockdown, and that would probably shred the electorate's patience for whichever government was responsible for it. But I don't think I could have anticipated the slowness of the New South Wales response. And I don't think any of us could have anticipated the way the Delta variant has worked, that it has continued to jump the borders. Not only is the New South Wales response slow, but they haven't been able to contain the outbreak to within their own borders. So we know in Melbourne we've had 2 seedings of Delta from Sydney. We know it travelled around the country and it made it to the NT. We know a couple of truck drivers may have brought it into Perth just the other week. It reminded me, as I was sort of watching this play out, obviously couldn't have anticipated the essay, it reminded me of what actually happened in Europe and in North America last year. Those borders are porous between those nation states. They all in the end tended to end up with very, very similar case numbers and very, very similar death rates. There's a big bunch of them. When you look at the countries that have done really well, relatively speaking, in the G20, it's obviously us, South Korea, China, a couple of countries outside the G20 like New Zealand and Taiwan, obviously. But within the G20 itself, where the virus took off in the first wave, there is a real bunching of caseloads and death rates. Once the thing gets out, doesn't matter whether you got a Trump or a Johnson or a Merkel or a Trudeau in charge or a Macron, it doesn't matter what federated system or what national form of governance you've got, how resilient your health system is, how compliant your population is. The way this virus travels, it tends to bring everybody down to the same level. Now, the difficulty, and I might throw this one back to John when he gets a chance, but David, with your intermediation, one thing I couldn't have anticipated, even in June, even worried that we'd left our vaccine run too late and worrying that we might have a third outbreak, the possibility of a double dip recession, and there is a possibility of a double dip recession, whilst the rest of the world is opening up. Even if Delta's coming back everywhere else, no one's going to go back into lockdown around the rest of the world. I can't find in my economic history a precedent for Australia double dipping into recession when the global economy is growing. And I wonder as we sort of look towards the end of this year, whether especially if New South Wales is unable to contain this thing, they get to 70 and 80% double dose vaccination rates, or these supposedly foolproof milestones in the National Cabinet Plan, whether the country is forced to live with the virus in the way that the rest of the world has been living with for the last 18 months. Are our systems up to it? And I don't just mean our health system, I mean our political system. Are we up to taking a second shock like that after we thought we'd dodged the biggest bullet of all last year? These are questions to me that I don't have the answers to. Even if I had an extra month to write the essay, I'd still be posing another 6 questions I don't have the answer to. But it is an occupational hazard when you're writing on these issues in real time. Thanks for your time, David, and I'll throw back to you and give you a second to get your NBN up.
Thanks for that, George. It's reassuring to know that journalists aren't clairvoyants, but it was useful that you provided the context on timing for your essay, and I suspect John had to labour against the same sorts of things. You mentioned that you thought you might have been preempting things about the quality of discussion. We needed to have a discussion on the quality of government response, and indeed you were, but there's no problem in that. You've put your cards on the table quite explicitly, and indeed you've actually said it in the essay that, you know, Australian governments, in particular federal governments, I read, are very good at dealing with crises relative perhaps to other governments in the Western world, but not so good at anticipating the strategic thinking that might be required to both emerge successfully with a coherent plan and also emerge with the capacity to deal with some of the inherent strengths and weaknesses that they inherited on the way in, as John would describe it. John's perhaps a bit more implicit in some of his worldview around some of these aspects, I suspect. But what I sense is, John, that you might be a bit more optimistic about the realities of it, that if I could put it crudely, you're perhaps less troubled than George about the tendency of Australian governments to muddle through, as it were. I'm just wondering whether I'm right in having this perception and what you might have to say about it. And in responding to that, I'm also interested in the fact that you spoke tonight about the strength of Canberra's response in other fora, and the strength of the RBA's response and the quality of the RBA's response relative to the US. But in other fora, you've talked about, in effect, this crisis potentially being a quite significant shift in power and the locus of strategic thinking about Australian economic policy making from Martin Place, the Reserve Bank, back towards Treasury in Canberra. So I'm wondering, John, you first, whether you could sort of wrap those up. You know, are you less troubled than George about the question of muddling through? And what can you tell us about who's actually leading and the degree to which we can rely upon them, as opposed to relying solely on our politicians?
Well, I think we have muddled through. I don't know how else one responds to an event which which we were incapable of predicting. You know, you can't. It's difficult to predict a plague, and you don't have a lot of time to respond to it. You know, you do what's at hand. And I think George made the point. The government was well advised. It was well advised by Treasury and well advised by the central bank. I think in that respect, the government's acceptance of the advice and the quality of the advice that was offered suggests to me that this, you know, in respect of COVID, the country was pretty well led, taking into account the, you know, the role of the bureaucracy as well. And I think coming out of it, you know, we do need to define exactly what the problem is. To my mind, the problem is productivity growth. How do we get back to, say, 1.5% productivity growth year after year from the, you know, 1 or 1.2% that we were experiencing in the 4 or 5 years prior to the pandemic? And I don't know exactly what the answer to that is, and nor does the Productivity Commission. I don't think it's in industrial relations structure, because we've had very good productivity growth with the same industrial relations structure we have now. I don't think it's in our tax arrangements, given that we've got to raise tax. We've had very good productivity growth with much the same tax arrangements as we have today. Treasury offers a view in the intergenerational report that the slowdown in productivity growth may have something to do with the slowness with which Australian business has adopted new technologies. And if that's so, that's something, you know, we need to look at very closely. It may have something to do with our, you know, increasingly being a service economy, but then there are periods in which, as a service economy, we had very good productivity growth. So it's not clear what's happening, but it's very clear we need to find out and, if possible, address it, because the quality of our economy over the next 20 or 30 years depends upon it. So I think that's what we need to identify as the major problem facing us, apart from the big question hanging over us, which is where we are in the economic competition between China and the US, given our increasing integration into the East Asian economic region. That again is an issue which, you know, requires careful thought. It's not obvious where we go. We need to think these things through. On the issue of the RBA versus Treasury, I made the point in the book that ever since the float released the RBA from the necessity to arrange its policy instruments around keeping a certain value for the Australian dollar, it has become the dominant player in Australian economic policy. It was previously Treasury, which was able to control the Reserve Bank through the exchange rate direction. And it became, you know, for so many decades since, it became the RBA. Well, we're now in a circumstance where Treasury has broken through, for the second time, as George makes the point, second time, it's broken through the notion that fiscal policy needs to be as it were, stable and allow monetary policy to do all the work of moderating the impact of the cycle. Treasury is now actively engaged in moderating the impact of economic fluctuations. It may well continue to do so. And at the same time, the RBA has the most expansionary policy settings that it's likely to have. It's basically at maximum extension of its expansionary policies. It doesn't have further to go. It'll go up at some point in the next couple of years, but it will retain for many years a huge portfolio of government bonds, which is satisfactory for the Australian government because the payment it makes on the bonds, the Reserve Bank will very largely return as profit on its operations to the Australian government. This kind of constrains the Reserve Bank, I think, or at least it's going to put more difficulties on the discretion of the Reserve Bank Board than was the case over the last decade. At the same time, there's greater, I think there'll be greater freedom of operation for Treasury. So I rather suspect that in a way, we will see some continuing recovery of Treasury's day-to-day economic authority and some limitations on quite what the RBA is able to do, particularly in the short run.
George?
Thanks for that. I agree with all that, and certainly that the dynamic between Martin Place and Parkes is certainly one of the big stories, one of the big policy stories of the pandemic. And thank you to John for elaborating on the 2008-9 precedent as well. Treasury has been able to deal itself back into the main game with both sides of politics now, which is something it hadn't been able to do for a long time before then. I've spent a little bit of time in the essay just touching on its role in previous economic crises, stopping governments from spending, then falling out with the government because for political reasons, government could no longer walk that tough Treasury line. And then you had the backlash after an election once the electorate had disposed of the government that couldn't deal with the recession. You remember the budget deficit we didn't know about. It always would pull rank afterwards by trashing the reputation of the previous government. It's well past that point now, and it's evolved into a relationship now that's much more active. It's not necessarily hands-on, but it's certainly much more active at a point of crisis, and we've now seen it twice. Now, each side of politics can talk about which of the interventions was better in 2008-9 or in 2020. That's sort of less interest to me than the shift in the idea from neutral, leave it to the Reserve Bank, to active fiscal policy in a crisis. And of course, once you release a politician to spend in a crisis, they're going to be less likely to let go of that lever in recovery. And this is in fact, I've got to sort of take your question and take it to the outside of macroeconomic policy to role of government. The question that's left hanging in the pandemic response, and you don't get a good sense that the Morrison government has thought enough about the future to figure out what it is it wants to be doing as a government in the recovery. And by that, I mean what its role is, what levers does it pull? Is it still writing checks on behalf of and contracting out to the private sector to deliver services like aged care? Doesn't seem likely now after the disaster last year in the Commonwealth regulated Victorian aged care sector last year. Does it want to continue to run that mixed public-private model in healthcare, when essentially the private system had been put on pause all through last year and again this year to deal with the pandemic? Does it want to continue to favour private schools over, say, the tertiary sector. Maybe politically it wants to, but all these questions are going to have to be answered in the next couple of terms. In this particular point in the cycle we're in now, whenever we get out of, lockdown, reopening, whenever we get out of that particular dialogue, whether this is a 2-year episode or a 5-year episode, whether it's a terrible shock or it's warlike in its World War I or World War II like in its length and dimension, at some point after that, we're going to have to figure out what it is the government does. And around the rest of sort of our peers, beginning with Joe Biden, and even Boris Johnson talks about it, are looking to reactivate the federal government, the national government, in the running of things in the economy. And they're looking at making massive investments in the US. We know Biden's just had his a compromise infrastructure package passed by Congress. We know he did a massive stimulus program almost on becoming president. We know Johnson talks about being the Tory Roosevelt in the UK. He talks about a New Deal coming out of the pandemic. We're not quite there in the debate in Australia, but we know some pressure points that have already been identified for us in the pandemic, and they are in the caring part of the economy, in aged care and in healthcare, in childcare, in education, and certainly in the tertiary sector and the university sector. Now, I've sort of come up with this phrase after the essay. Sometimes this happens to you as an author. Your penny drops. Events don't clarify things for you. There was a concept I was sort of toying with, which I do want. I don't necessarily want to push it as my idea, but it's a conversation I think we need to start as a country. If the government, the Commonwealth government we're talking about now, if the Commonwealth government needs to reimpose itself, reassert itself, restore its position in the national economy, so we're way past now the 80s and 90s question about what you let go. Obviously, the Treasury has got to a position in a crisis where it advises active fiscal policy. I think by definition, once you've had that epiphany through 2 crises now, the question of what government does in recovery is the next most logical question. Now, as I said, there's a concept I'm sort of toying with in the essay, and I only really raises a couple of questions. In a sector like aged care, it strikes me that the Commonwealth doesn't want the responsibility to run aged care. We know Scott Morrison even struggled with the idea that the Commonwealth regulates aged care when the virus gets into it. Apparently, it had nothing to do with him. As a Victorian, David, if you were around last year, in Victoria? Did you come back last year?
No, I wasn't. No.
Yeah, well, last year, and I remember the date because as a journo, I'll never forget the date because at some point I'm going to recycle it in the column. On the 19th of August, which is the day that the Prime Minister did announce the first letter of agreement with AstraZeneca, this was a day of hope for the entire, it wasn't just a hope for Australia, it was a hope for the world. He used that word hope a lot of times in the press conference at North Ryde. That was also the day that he told Dan Andrews he was on his own, that once the virus gets out in the community, it has nothing to do with the Commonwealth. Now, that may be political, that may be a bit of political blame shifting, but when you sort of lift the hood under and have a look at the mechanics of what it is he was saying, the Commonwealth doesn't want to run aged care. So my question is, does the Commonwealth in an area like aged care, and does this become the template for a re-engagement of the national government in the economy, not in a Whitlam-esque way, but in a sort of 21st century way? Does it contract in? Does it figure out a way to incentivise and fund the states to deliver some of these programs themselves, to bring back onshore things that the private sector has been managing, I think, probably for too long, on the basis of lowest costs, on the basis of, find a way to manage the problem onto another side of the budget, which can then be contracted out to another part of the budget as well. I only spent a couple of pages on aged care, and I also obviously spent a couple of pages on the idea of what a government might do in infrastructure and what a government might do in human capital. But if you think conceptually that this is the first time in 30 odd years, and the sort of conversations we've been having about role of government, this is the first time that we can clarify the stepping back in to a sphere, and it's a sphere that should never have been let go to the private sector. The other question, we haven't touched on it in either of our presentations to start with, Climate change, which is obviously the issue that federal Labor couldn't progress in 2009 and 2010, in the period where the window was widest for them, and they had a lot of mission from the electorate to do something then. Climate change is obviously a clear and present policy challenge, regardless of the ideological predisposition of a Conservative government. The rest of the world is almost bullying us into a position where we're going to have to start to nominate some targets, and that by definition brings the Commonwealth back into another sphere of the running of things. And I don't mean just managing the economic cycle, I mean literally doing something that we thought in the 80s and 90s was heresy. So that's how I'd expand on some of the lessons of the pandemic. Some of these things were obvious before the pandemic, but the pandemic has, in a sense, accelerated the thinking on it because, you know, that crummy little virus does find a way to exploit the gaps. It exploits the gaps in the federation responsibilities between federal and state, where all the blame shifting is. It's brilliantly exploited the gaps in systems that are shared between public and private. And it certainly exploited gaps in the labour market model that we're operating in with casualised work. It's exploited the gaps in terms of the safety net. Some people won't get a test when they're symptomatic because our government, it was Victoria's problem last year, New South Wales' problem this year, they won't pay them to stay at home. They won't give them sick leave. If their employer won't give them sick leave. All these questions now have been accelerated by the pandemic. And if this thing is going to mutate and continue to come back year on year, there will have to be a reckoning. So rather than having a government pat itself on the back about how it successfully managed the crisis, how it indemnifies us in future from the obvious, which is the thing might come back and our systems will have to freeze again whilst we prioritise the health of the nation.
Thanks for that, George. Look, I'm conscious of time, so we'll have to skate a bit now, and we've got a fair build-up of questions, some of which I'll try and get to. But I might just go back to John because there's a number of threads there. But if we can just pick up the thread of the degree to which the Commonwealth becomes involved again. Clearly, the Commonwealth has at times stepped back in terms of its in-house development of policy, but it might actually be arguable whether in fact it did retreat on service delivery in the first place, because to some degree, even, or actually particularly, you know, under the influence of Peter Walensky in the Whitlam days, the Commonwealth relied a lot on states and attempted on occasion to involve local governments to do the actual service delivery beyond things it did itself, either through Defence or the old Department of Administrative Services. So my view is you would question the degree to which the Commonwealth ever really been involved in service delivery as opposed to service design and service strategy. So picking that up, John, my first question would be, you know, where does the balance sit in terms of an equitable delivery of service, you know, and the degree to which you rely on the Federation, with the Commonwealth perhaps sending the signals, but the states and possibly local government delivering things, number one. Number two, picking up George dwelling on his very broadly defined caring sector, to which I might add something that's been in the private domain, which is, you know, the hospitality sector and the tourism sector, for example, all of which have been very heavily and very suddenly challenged, perhaps affected more than most sectors, some of the other sectors in the economy, and all of which have been affected to some degree by a pause in what I'd call, or what Bob Hawke actually called, the hidden secrets of our immigration and population policy, in that they were used as a basis for growth. They were, as the Reserve Bank is starting to shine a bit of a light on, undoubtedly used as a basis for dealing with skills on the cheap, and undoubtedly used as a basis for perhaps moderating wage levels, which arguably, well, quite strongly arguably, in my opinion, are a bit deficient and are posing a bit of a problem. In fact, particularly when you look at it as someone like Paul Keating might, in terms of wage levels versus profit share, and who's getting what. Pulling all of those sorts of things together, if we were to see more in-house government delivery, possibly through delegation across the federal system, and continuing restraints on inbound immigration as we emerge out of COVID, what does it do in terms of equity? What does it do in terms of setting a task for a federal government, John?
Well, look, I agree with you, David, very much so. That I'm much more concerned in terms of the functioning of the federal government. I'm much more, I'm not really concerned with the federal government paying people to, paying private enterprises or the states to actually implement policies, for example, like aged care or health. What I am concerned about is the quality of advice from the Commonwealth and the quality of policy making. If the Commonwealth, as the Commonwealth continues to contract out more and more of its policy making functions to consultants, I think that troubles me more as an issue than a model, which I think is perfectly sensible, where the Commonwealth sets the policies, funds the policies, but has them enacted either by the states or by private enterprise. I think it's, I understand where George is coming from, but I think it's incredibly unlikely that either of the two major parties would initiate a very big expansion of aged care facilities owned and operated by the Commonwealth. I don't think either major party will want to go in that direction. I don't think they should. On this big issue of wages growth, I mean, this is it's troubling the Reserve Bank. Wages growth has been very slow. It's very good, I think, to see that the Reserve Bank has made a connection between the rate of unemployment, which it wants to get down at least to 4.5 and perhaps lower, in order to push up wages growth, in order, to get inflation back up to its target of 2.5%. So that's good that the Reserve Bank will be focusing, coming out of this pandemic, on getting wages growth up. I think that the jury's still out a bit on whether the very low rate of growth of wages has been caused by a high rate of growth of profits. In other words, that there's been a marked shift in recent years to profits. It's obscured a bit by the increased importance of mining in GDP. It's obscured a bit by various technical things like how you attribute the imputed income from housing. It does seem to have stabilised a bit in recent years. But anyway, that'll have to be a focus of both major parties and certainly of the Reserve Bank as we come out of the pandemic.
I might throw an international economic question to you, George. I mean, and this will have to be the last one, unfortunately, because we're running very close to time. But we've spoken about a lot about the domestic approach to, emerging from the pandemic. But to what degree is all of this in our hands versus in the hands of Joe Biden or Premier Xi?
Good question.
Are we going to be bystanders?
We don't need to be, but I think we probably could cut to the chase on, say, the climate change debate. Commonwealth government, Morrison government wants to go to Glasgow with a position that still assumes the next election is decided in Queensland and it doesn't matter what happens in Victoria. So it won't want to be in the position Morrison's been at all the virtual pandemic get-togethers, all the leaders meetings on Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever it is they use, where everyone's backslapping him on the death rate. No one wants to backslap Morrison on being the last rich nation to take climate change seriously. So we may well be a bystander on climate change, but I guess the question of what the international economy looks like in the next few years, this competition between the US and China, now I've likened that first decade of the 21st century to be probably the, outside of the gold rush of the 1850s, you've never had the whole world going to work on Australia's behalf in quite the way China and the US went to work on Australia's behalf in the first decade of the 21st century. Americans are cheering China on. They're the 6th or 7th largest economy by size at the turn of the 21st century, and by 2010 they're number 2. By 2011 they're number 2. They're quite happy to let us piggyback. We dig for them, and they send us their best and brightest for as skilled workers and as tertiary students. The Americans were running a sort of friendly competition model since 2011, of course, which is since 2008, 9, and certainly since 2011, when the Chinese have switched towards a more assertive position in the global economy. They haven't hurt us as much as they probably thought they would last year, because they still relied on iron ore. But we've got the US moving in a different direction now. We've got the US, in a sense, it's a counter cycle in the US where they're activating their government again, and we're trying to figure out how to lead it to the private sector and recovery. That part of the question about whether the US is still setting all the prices that matter to us in the global economy, I'm not sure. I'm just not sure. And I'd be interested in John's thoughts on this. If we could jump back to John, I'm not sure that the international economy is as stable for us as it was in the previous 20-something years. Now, we had to make our own luck in the 80s and 90s, but I think a fair bit of luck was granted to us in the intervening 20 years. The Americans are interesting. They're sort of obviously withdrawing from Afghanistan. They got out of Iraq a little while ago. They've been through their America First phase with Trump. So there's a lot more sort of multilateral engagement from Biden. But are we the sort of country he wants to hang out with? That's a question that we've never faced before as a nation. The Deputy Sheriff doesn't want to serve, certainly doesn't want to serve on climate change, and still thinks it doesn't have to choose between China and the US economically. I'd rather we didn't have to choose between the two of them economically. Friends shouldn't ask you to choose on questions like that about where you get your dough. But the security question, we've obviously already made the choice. We want the Americans engaged in the region. I didn't mean to sound wishy-washy on it, but it's such a tricky thing. I don't think looking forward the next 5 to 10 years, we couldn't predict a pandemic, as John said. I don't think we could predict where the US and China will be 5 or 10 years from now.
John, I might go to you for a quick 30-second return of serve, and then we'll probably have to close out, unfortunately.
Well, I think, they're great issues. As to the kindness of the global economy, I think it depends on two things. Our engagement with it. depends on two things. One is the openness of the global economy to trade and investment. And despite a lot of claims to the contrary, I don't think there is any evidence that globalisation, freedom of trade, freedom of investment have been seriously compromised over the last 5 years. We don't have time to talk about that. So just let me put that one on the table and say otherwise the most favourable aspect of the global economy to us has been the growth of China and the associated expansion of the entire East Asian economy. And that's why I think we need to remain engaged in it.
Fair enough. Well, on that note, we'll have to bring it to a close. John and George, thank you very much for giving us your time tonight. I suspect we could have gone on for at least another 90 minutes. We've got a massive bank up of questions out there, unfortunately, that we're not going to be able to get to. So I apologise to everyone. But do thank our speakers who've given us tremendous value. Next week, we'll be joined by Gideon Haigh. We'll be doing quite a shift. We'll be talking about Doc Evatt and Gideon Haigh's new book, The Brilliant Boy, which is about Doc Evatt, but unlike previous biographies of Doc Evatt, it focuses a lot more on his legal career and a fascinating early court case he was involved in when sitting on the High Court bench. The week after that, on the 15th, we'll be joined by Jenny Macklin and Kate Thwaites talking about their book, Enough is Enough, and the challenges that we have to deal with to ensure that women can play their role in federal parliament. And without foreshadowing too much, the week after we have Jenny and Kate, we will have a panel of female economists who will be talking to us about some of the equity implications of what we've been discussing tonight. So on behalf of the Chifley Research Centre, I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight and wish you a safe and happy evening.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you to everyone.
Thanks, George. All gone?
Just people are just closing out now, John.
I wondered, Daisy, if you're still on the line, is there any way you can save and transmit the questions?
Yes, I think I can go through the recording and save those for you. Just aware that we're still live to everyone, but I think I can probably...
But John, there is a facility on, they give you 3 recordings, one of which does have a line of the written questions.
Yes, I see.
That'll come to us overnight.
What I can do is I'll email those through to you when those come through to me.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah. Thank you.
No worries.
Pity we didn't get to address them, but an hour is not very long, really, is it?
Really wasn't very long. Went by quite quickly.
Yeah. Anyway, look, thanks very much.
Anyway, thank you. We're still live, so I'll come back to you both in the morning.
Excellent. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay. Cheers, guys.